Greetings, traveler.
Okay guys, so patch review time. We're gonna go over everything that was announced in the latest patch. This is the first real balance patch that we've had in the buddy meta, and it's pretty damn fast. I think we've had about a week of buddies, so seems like a good amount of time to let that pass, look at what all the crazy shit is, and then figure out how to address things. Before we go into the patch, we could say that there were two really big problems in terms of balance, where on the one hand we had Gula Cabra just being ridiculous, where you could stack a bunch of death rattles, combo it with Macaw, with Titus, and essentially get a bunch of leverage to get way more ghoul buffs, and it's all permanent scaling during the combat. The other one was repeat battlecry triggers for buddies. Instead of starting with the beginning and going over all the buddy changes, I'm going to go over these two things being addressed, and then with that knowledge, we're going to dive into the buddy changes. So, first and foremost, they have removed the Draconic Death Scale, which I think is fair. It's not necessarily what I thought they were going to do. So Draconic Death Scale was super good because a ton of the Battlecry buddies were now repeatable. Death Scale is by far the easiest way to do that, because you are guaranteed to do it every turn. It works with Bran, you can get multiples of these, you can golden it, you can just roll them during the turn and just sell them and cycle even more. So yeah, Death Scale was definitely the best one. But as we'll see, there is no removal on Murkai, the Trigger Battlecry spell, or Rylak. So I'm still a little bit concerned. Certain Battlecry buddies are still going to be really good, where if you just have a Murkai and you can repeat it every turn, or if you just have two trigger Battlecry spells, it's still ridiculous. So we're gonna go over the whole patch and then I'll give you my conclusion at the end. So minion pool changes. The Draconic is out. Smuggler and Hunter of Gatherers are back in. Smuggler coming back in makes a lot of sense because Quilboar were already really fringe at high MMR. Now I think at lower MMR, they were probably just really good because they're very straightforward. I get gem scaling, I play gem buffing. Nice. Right, there's no real little weird things you have to do. It's pretty straightforward. Also, you can start playing quills and just finish playing quills. You don't have to transition. You can just buy a Piper, buy some Jazzers, and now you're quills. And you do quills for the rest of the game, and that's good. At high MMR, that doesn't really work. It's very unlikely that you can just buy some Pipers and then just roll and then, oh, I have Charlies, now I'm OP. No, it's not good enough. So the only way you could play Quilboar at high MMR was to play Gem Smuggler and then repeat Battlecry triggers. Now, funny enough, they have removed Draconic, so you're making it harder for Gem Smuggler to be good. I really hope Draconic's going to come back after the buddy patch is out, because I do love playing with that minion. I think it's a lot of fun. Now, you can still play this with Murkai, so I think that's probably going to be the most common thing people are going to do. You have a Gem Smuggler on the board, try to golden it, try to have your Bran, get your Drakari, get your Murkai, and just pump. Then Hunter of Gatherers is probably just a little bit of a change so that they have a tier 5 dragon in. Draconic left, Hunter of Gatherers back in. This is one of those cards that is sometimes okay in the mid game, but it's not like crazy good. It also has a particularly slow animation, so I'm not sure if they've fixed that yet. I haven't really played with it, but I remember back when I would play Golden Brand Caligo's boards, a Hunter of Gatherer would essentially make your game run too slow, and even was a 200, you would just sell that sucker. Get out of here, right? Because it would just slow everything down. Because it was just these insane flashbang animations where your whole board would just go and you would just not get anything done. So we'll see if they have changed that. So for the Skyblazer, this is now a +1/+1 buff, and they buffed the stat line slightly. We'll see. Self-damage beast wasn't really a comp for me in buddy meta so far, just because everything was so crazy. There were so many opportunities to do crazy Battlecry buddy stuff, so many opportunities to do crazy ghoul buffing, so why were you ever going to play Skyblazer? But again, I think at lower MMRs, it's probably a really solid thing to play, so I can understand why they're being a little bit scared here if they're gonna nerf some of the other comps, that they're not gonna touch this. So I think it's fair. I'm not sure how much it matters for my games because I wasn't really playing a lot of Beast. Then Lasher went from +1/+1 to +2 health permanently. This kind of just kills the card off again. Which is really funny because this used to be the way it worked, where it was just health. And I mean, it's still a pile of health and it's 9 damage. So I don't think it's like killed off completely where you can't play it a little bit in the early game, but a 9/400 does not do anything. It's completely useless, right? A 9/400 that gets like 4 shots by a 50/50, right? Or 8 shots, right? If it's 400, but whatever. But you get my point, right? It's not a good minion. You need a lot more damage for the card to be useful, and it's tough to increase the damage. I think you can, with Ghoul, right? It's probably going to be acceptable, because we're going to go over ghoul as well. Actually, let's talk about it once we see the ghoul change. All right, so we have synthesizer here. It's now plus 3+2 instead of 3+1. So this likely just means they've seen dragons underperform and are giving some dragon buffs, as we're going to see that trend continues here. Terragosa is now a 5/5 instead of a 4/4. Whelp Smuggler is now a 2/5 instead of a 2/3. All of these changes tell me the same thing. It's like, oh, dragons weren't winning enough. We're going to make them just a little bit stronger. We're just going to try to bump it up a little bit, make all these cards a little bit better. Now there might be some interesting repeat battlecry trigger on synthesizer, because if you have a golden synthesizer, you could realistically play Murkai, or you could play Reborn Rylak and then play Poets, and now you're getting all these combat buffs permanently with your Poets. So these are like some cute little things you could do. Then Roaring Rallier is now +3/+1, 6/2 when it's golden. So this was absolutely broken when it gave 2 health. So I'm not exactly sure if it's going to be 3 damage, 1 health, if it's going to feel similar to that. I still think it's worse than when it's 2/2, but it's obviously better than when it's 2/1. So this is always a bit of a risky card to buff, because it's such a feels bad moment when you lose to it. So for this one, I'm not entirely sure how good 3/1 is going to feel. But yeah, 2 health was ridiculous. Here we are, the ghoul nerf. So this is the big one, right? The draconic removal and the ghoul nerf, those are the 2 really, really big ones. It goes from a 2/11 to a 3/12, so they're buffing ghoul. All right, end of slide. Right, no, of course not. Whenever you trigger a death rattle, give your minions +2/+2 permanently is now after a friendly death rattle minion dies, give your minions 2/2 permanently. So this is the nerf that we saw coming, or at least I thought was pretty obvious, because so most people I think would say, oh, they were just going to make it 1/1, but I don't think that would work at all, because you still had the problem that people could just stack a shit ton of death rattles on one unit, then have a golden Reborn Macaw, golden Titus, multiple ghouls, and +1/+1 for a trigger would still have a stupid amount of scaling, especially if they are nerfing the other compositions that were OP as well, like, you know, the trigger buddy battlecry stuff, because even then if you only got half the scaling, it would still be broken. How does this function now with this Lasher? Because that's essentially what we're looking at. Before, when Lasher was just a pure health scaling unit, it was extremely difficult to consistently give it damage. Very hard. You would have the Skyblazer and you'd kind of hope and get a little bit of stats. But when you have a Ghoul Cabra on the board, you're getting 2/2 permanently every time a Death Rattle minion dies. If you have, say, a Mech Horse on the board, that is still a really, really good tempo play, because let's compare this again to a card that was in the game for a very long time, Fell Stomper, and then reworked to Death Stomper because of the types. But this was a card that would give you +3 attack to your whole board every time a minion spawned during the combat. That's not super different from a Death Rattle minion dying, right? Spawning a minion versus a Death Rattle minion dying, especially when you have cards like Coiler, a Death Rattle that makes more Death Rattles, Mech Horse, a Death Rattle that makes more Death Rattles. This still seems very, very good compared to that. You're getting the permanent scaling in the combat. I think the one problem for Ghoul, if you will, is that it's buddy meta. So during the buddy meta, comps just tend to go vertical. It's just like money and pop off. I think this card would be really good outside of buddy meta, because you're adding quite easy to get permanent combat scaling that is not discriminatory based on the minion types. So it'll buff Titus, right? It'll buff anything that's not a beast or an undead. That's really good. My only fear for this kind of scaling is that it's like too strong when buddies are out and not relevant when buddies are in. But we're going to see how it feels. Of course, I haven't played with the card yet, but it is it's a good card, right? This is a strong, especially, you know, compare it to the Fell Stomper. Fell Stomper gave +3 attack temporarily. This was a pure tempo buff. This is still a permanent combat buff. Like, you can't really underestimate how good that is. You can just put this in a beast comp with a Titus, and the Titus will get strong. It'll give your Lasher damage. So especially where, if you're at an MMR where you don't necessarily see people popping off super hard with buddies, I wouldn't count this card out completely at all. Obviously, compared to what it did before, it's nothing, but it was committing crimes against humanity with before the nerf. So now we have Jazzer on tier 2. So they've gone a little bit back and forth on this. We definitely had a Quill Supremacy moment when this was on tier 2, and then people were just really relying on tripling this and then farming it with Rylak and getting these huge gem stacks. I think that was before Pokey was a card, so I wonder how this is going to play out with Rylak. If you're in a Quillbore Beast lobby, if this is still going to be a thing people do. Now, especially with the 5-drop that does temporary gem buffs, I can see that being a thing where you farm a lot of gem value, and then you have the 3 little piggies on tier 5 that give you a lot of gems. You can, because essentially it would work pretty well with Titus, because you'd have Titus on board to combine this with your Rylak. You would have a lot of stats, and then the Titus with the 3 little piggies would give you even more procs, and then you could maybe even run something like a macaw. And that way you don't even need any super permanent scaling, but you would just get a shit ton of combat buffs. It's kind of like Goldrun on steroids. Your whole board would just get a ton of stats. The one problem is that the 3 little piggies do only target Quilboar. So you would not be buffing that Titus. The macaw would not get buffed, but that usually doesn't matter. You kind of want it to die anyway with the reborn. So you would have to run something like a Rugug, then spread those gems. You would have to run something like Tough Tusk and reset your shield. So there's definitely something there. If Gem Smuggler is back in, you could either go for the permanent scaling or you could go for the combat scaling with the 3 little piggies. So we'll see how the Jazzer buff plays out. But that's definitely a thing people did last time this was on tier 2. Then Boon of Beetles now summons 1 big beetle. Good. This card was dumb. It's probably still nice, honestly. Like when you're in the end game, getting an extra body that could tank Leroy, that's not bad. A 10-10, now you're gonna have a real incentive to make your Leroy 11 health. Because having your Leroy die to this is super bad, and it only costs 1 gold. Now the previous beetle version was much better, of course. For only 1 gold more, you would spawn 3 extra beetles and more bodies that would get buffs, and I like it. It's a good nerf. Then we got some other changes. Jailer Buddy was removed from the ETC pool, which is fantastic. I love that they actually did that, because last time this survived the whole buddy meta, but looks like there were enough complaints about this combo being way too strong that they removed it. So what would happen is the Soul Keeper would get goldened by the Reno Buddy early on, and then you would just summon 6 extra minions on turn 4, which is ridiculous. This is so much damage taken. On top of that, the invocation on the Raptor cannot be triggered during the recruit phase. It's the lightning invocation, which is the one that deals damage. So this was something where you could actually kill minions in the shop with Brewcon Buddy if you triggered the Death Rattle. Which is just one of those things you're like, okay, let's just remove that. And then for duos, there are several nerfs where you cannot combine these insane heroes anymore. Like, for instance, Shutterwalk, Zephyrus, and, you know, Shutterwalk being able to trigger the Zephyrus buddy, etc., etc. So Alex was nerfed to now cost a gold to discover a dragon. That's still good. I would say for most MMRs, Alex is still going to be a top tier hero where you are. Well, actually, the buddy got nerfed, didn't it? We're gonna look at that. So let me have a look at the buddy nerf. The buddy nerf was quite a lot. I think it went to tier 5. So, but the hero power itself is still good. So let's get that out of the way. The hero power itself is still fantastic. Onyxia was changed to now be Avenge 4. I think that's fair. It's not like she was a problem at all at high MMR in most lobbies I was playing in, but you know, back when Death Stomper was still a card. The Whelp counting for the Avenge was just so silly. So now this is technically Avenge 3, where the Whelp will count for 1, and then 3 more things have to die. Because it was a little infuriating just how easily Onyxia was just able to chain those minions over and over and over and over again. All right, so here's the buddy change that we touched on. Alexstrasza is now going from a tier 3 to a tier 5, and it's going to be a +3/+3 buff. So right now it was very annoying to face Alexstrasza, let's say like turn 6, turn 7, because then she had her buddy on the board for sure, which gives her a lot of tempo. So we'll have to see how this plays out being a tier 5. Now I think across most metas, again, it's still going to be a good hero because you're going to be able to build that dragon comp super consistently, because similar to Ajara, who first has to complete a quest, which is a lot harder than just leveling to 4. You then unlock the ability to discover a minion from your type for only 1 gold. That's super good. So she's going to be super consistent at building that dragon board. The Veil hitting later might hurt her tempo enough to not make her an S tier hero for most MMRs. I would say at the lobbies I was playing in most of the time, I would not rate this an S tier hero just because she doesn't really cheat gold. She doesn't really allow you to pop off. So we'll see how this impacts it. But I think for the most part, it's still a very strong hero. Then Ajara was nerfed to be a tier 6 buddy. So this is good for 2 reasons. Number 1, you cannot cast Eyes of the Earth Mother on this anymore. That was a huge problem because what people would very consistently do is play Eyes of the Earth Mother on their Imperial Defender and then hero power and get 2 more Imperial Defenders, which they can then potentially also golden if they hit more Eyes of the Earth Mother. So this being a tier 6 makes a lot of sense. It also is now just much slower to get. So you're not necessarily always going to stabilize with your Deep Blue. Does this mean that Ajara is a bad hero now? Intuitively, no, I don't think so. I think she still has the very clear path ahead of her with the Deep Blue comp And when you get an Imperial Defender, you're still getting an additional deep blue cast, so it scales a lot faster. But the fact that it's a tier 6 makes it a lot harder to get. So I think at very high MMR, again, the game is going to be a little bit too fast paced. So I think this is a bit of a discrepancy when you hear me talk about like high MMR, lower MMR. For the most part, I would say, let's say 8K and under. I think these heroes that have a very clear game plan laid out are super good because, and if it's a strong game plan, of course, right? The Alex, very strong game plan. The Jara, very strong game plan. You usually aren't under enough pressure that you're going to die before you can pull it off. Whereas I think when you're 8K and up, then suddenly the pace of the game changes a bit. People are very efficient at building boards early. They're better at setting up high rolls, and they're going to hit you harder in the mid game. So having to pay a ton of gold for your Imperial Defender, you're more likely going to die now setting up your deep blue. So I don't think she's a S tier anymore for high MMR with this change. But again, right, these are all just speculations. I have to still play almost all of these. I've only played one game on the patch so far, seeing as it's so new. Then the Hogger nerf. Wow. After you buy 2 pirates, gain 1/1 and add a pirate to the tavern. So for high MMR, this is now dead. Yeah, you have to buy 2 pirates now to add a pirate to the tavern, which means you can't just sit on the same tavern. You're gonna have to roll. This like completely changes the pace at all. So maybe again, right, at lower MMR, this is still viable, where you again have direction. You have a buddy that scales with buying pirates. You're getting more pirates. It's more likely you're gonna see the Tethys, or you're gonna build the dealers. But again, at very high MMR, this is just, it's gonna be too slow if you have to roll for the pirates, right? You can't just sit in the same shop and buy. That's the only reason it was viable at high MMR. So now this is just, it's so slow. Possibly that it's still decent at lower MMR, but for my lobbies, I wouldn't want to pick him anymore. So now we have the buddy for Yogg. It's essentially just going from a tier 4 to a tier 5, which I think is fair. This was super good. And they've also made the buff effect from the wheel. They've now only made that target 1 minion. So 1 minion gives a stats to another one. So probably a little bit too good if you rolled that and you had big minions on your board. For endgame, this was probably really powerful, where you just had, oh, that 200, it's moving to here. Oh, and that 200, it's moving to there. So that's just plus 400 that you could get. Then we see Sour Fang going from a tier 4 to a tier 5. That also makes sense, right? These are all just small changes, small nerfs. It's a good buddy. You can really combine it with a lot of good effects. Then again here, right, a nerf from tier 3 to tier 4. There was just, getting this early on Lich is just a little bit too useful. So a tier 3 buddy and a tier 4 buddy are pretty different, because when you have a tier 3 buddy, the chance that you can get that on the 6 gold turn is very high. A tier 4 buddy actually costs you a lot of money to be able to get that on turn 4. A tier 4 on turn 4 is almost only something you're going to do if it's something like Snake Eyes, Scabs, Tests, right? You would pay for that, but we'll see that those buddies got changed as well. But here, this doesn't make sense to pay a lot of money to then play this on turn 4, because you're not going to have enough money to hero power. So what you would want is you'd want to get this out on turn 4. Maybe if you have extra money, you can hero power. Probably you just set it up for next turn. It would cost you like 6 gold or something. As a tier 3 on turn 4, it would cost you like 6 gold. You just like press your button and you're done, and you get your buddy, and next turn you can start hero powering for free. That's now no longer the case. So it's not like Lich is now garbage. It's just that it's made it harder. It's like you have to actually sacrifice something if you want this out. You might have to stay on tier 2 an extra turn if you want this out and then hero power. Then Maiev goes from a tier 2 to a tier 3. I think that's an excellent nerf, because this was way too fast. However, with no additional changes to Maiev and with no removal to the trigger battlecry spell, Rylak and Murkai, I think this is a huge oversight. A slap on the wrist with no other changes. And Maiev was probably the best hero in the game at high MMR. We're talking like, let's say 10k plus, straight up the best hero in the game. They only gave her a wrist slap, and they severely nerfed several other buddies and cards and strategies. So I'm a little bit scared to see what Maiev can do now, because you can still keep this on the board. You can still roll trigger battlecry spell. It's still really good to be able to make a golden brand. You still have access to it very quickly. Especially if you can go for a double trigger, you can still get it in the same turn. So a little bit scared as to what this is going to do. 9 Frog going from tier 5 to tier 6, that makes sense. 9 Frogs was super good. So now it's still good. It's just more expensive. That makes sense. I think this is good to try these. I think this is the first round of nerfs. So given that it's buddy meta, given how volatile it is, we will probably see another patch within the buddy meta. Probably not straight away, but I think for the first round of nerfs for a lot of these buddies, I think it's okay if they say, let's just increase it a tier and let's see what that does. I think for a lot of heroes, that's going to fix it. That's just going to be like, okay, their win rate is now acceptable. However, for something like this, I don't think it's going to work. So this is probably going to require further balancing. This, I think, might work. This is like, okay, this is now costs the same as Sylvanas. It's still very good when you get it. It's just going to be harder to get it out early. Blackthorn is going from a tier 5 to a tier 6. For high MMR, this makes no sense. Nobody was playing this. But again, they buffed the Jazzer. Jazzer's now a tier 2 instead of a tier 3. Again, at lower MMR, this was absolutely a thing. There was even on my tier list that I made, there was even comments on YouTube being like, you're out of your mind. This is so good. I always win with this guy. And then I don't want to ask like, but what MMR are you playing at? But that's essentially because it's a very straightforward game plan. You can start quills and end quills. You never have to pivot. It's very safe. It's very guided. So I can see why this had to get nerfed. It was probably performing quite well in sort of the low and mid-level tiers. Then boxcars, that was not, this is very different. This was good at all MMRs. It's just ridiculous. It's free value. It's very good. So they were just like, tier 5? Nah, make that sucker a tier 6 straight away. So I don't know about this right now. I think if Snake Eyes continues to have 5 armor, this might just be too slow. You hero power, like what turn do you even get this out, right? It used to be turn 4. That's now impossible. You were not getting this out on turn 4. There's no way. There's no amount of dice rolling that can do that for you. We're talking turn 7 or something? Turn 7, and that's like good game, right? When you've played like Pen Pal, you're doing it on your hero power turn. This might be too slow now. Again, I'll have to play it, but my instinct is telling me that I'll die if I go for this. I'll have especially if Snake Eyes won't get a lot of armor, which it probably won't, right? You're talking about a very fragile hero that won't have a buddy. Then Shenvala, this is very similar. It's going from a tier 3 to a tier 4. It was just performing a little bit too well. Again, right? It's one of those buddies that gives you a very clear game plan. You can just start elementals, end in elementals. This wasn't really destroying people at high MMR. For me, this is going to make me even less likely to pick Shenvala, but I can see why it would be performing a little bit too strong in Blizzard stats. Then Rakanishu, this one makes a lot of sense because I would say Rakanishu is a pure tempo hero that now suddenly had a game plan for the end game. You could play Greymane with all the Lantern Lights, you could play Nala with all the Lantern Lights, and that is absolutely still an option now. I would say that Rakanishu, when we look at all these people, all these buddies getting nerfed, I think Rakanishu can still get away with this, especially at lower levels where there's going to be less tempo early, going to be less punished for getting this out a turn later. It's totally viable. I think you could even stay on tier 3 an extra turn to get this because you recover pretty damn quickly once those Lantern Lights start entering your hand, and you still have the option of playing the end game comp that is Greymane because all the Lantern Lights are even, or Nala because it's all spells. So even though this is going to hurt Rakanishu, I don't think he's unplayable at all right now. Greybow going from a tier 4 to a tier 5. Not a very popular hero, but I can see, again, lower mid-level that this was a little bit too easy because it made its... you cannot play Eyes of the Earth Mother on it anymore. You also have a game plan straight away. It's like, oh, I just need to play Taunt now. I just need to play Death Rattle so they get taunted and then I shield everything. So, well, we'll see how this plays out, but I'm not super inclined to play Greybow myself. Then Elise going from a tier 2 to a tier 3. I can see that, right? Elise is pretty good, pretty flexible. This is the example of a hero that you would play at high MMR. It's very flexible. You can do whatever you want. You can just hero power, make 5 drops, make 6 drops, then especially if you combine this with Rarran, make your hero power cost 0, do it again like 2 turns later. So lots of 5s, lots of 6 drops, and early tempo because you can just hero power and then make your buddy. So again, doesn't really make her unplayable, just makes it a bit slower. You now have to think a little bit more. It's not as free. Then Vol'jin going from a tier 5 to a tier 6. That's probably because of how good it was in Shelemental lobbies, and something I missed on my tier list, how good it is in Demon lobbies, which makes sense because even though with Shelemental it's a bit easier, you don't have to buy the whole shop. If you're playing demons and you have a Fellbat, you're eating the whole shop anyway, so you can just swap stats to the shop and make them permanent. Or if you're playing something like a golden implicator that's going to double the stats, you could just justify buying out the whole shop except one minion, make that minion huge, eat it, you now double the stats. So all these minions, all these buddies going from tier 5 to tier 6, pretty much what that's doing is it increases the risk that you die before you get it going. Reno Jackson goes from a tier 1 to a tier 2. Again, same thing here. It was just a little bit too easy to get a triple with this, and then golden your 5, golden your 6. I think with Reno, the thing that's going to hit him hard already is that Ghoul is so heavily nerfed. The reason why Reno was probably performing so well is that the Reno buddy would make golden Titus and golden Ghoul in the back, and that would just scale like crazy. So now if you get 2 ghouls, that's still really good. You get 2 golden ghouls, it's a death rattle, it buffs. I don't think Reno is unplayable now. It's just again, bit of a slap on the wrist, make him a little bit less powerful. Sneed going from a tier 5 to a tier 6. I'm not really sure about this. Ghoul is no longer going to be comboable with this. I'm not sure if this nerf was needed. I might just be missing why this is going to be necessary. Like, what other death rattle is being abused with this? It makes tier 5s now. That's true, but still, buddy meta has super high pace. So whenever you have a tier 6 buddy, you need a ridiculous power spike. So you have to keep that in mind. So while you guys are thinking, oh, this is now, you know, gonna summon Leroy's, which is true, that's relevant, that's absolutely relevant, you're getting it out pretty late. Like, you're playing Sneed, not good without the buddy. If you have to wait until it's kind of like Sylvanas, right? And then Sylvanas doubles your stats. So that's worth the wait, especially in an undead lobby. So I'll have to see. But yeah, my instinct is that I'm not really inclined to play Sneed. But maybe I'm completely wrong about this and it's just really good to summon 5s. Putricide going from tier 3 to tier 4. I did not play any Putricide. I rarely saw any Putricide, but again, this is something that pushes you in a direction. Just play Undead. I can see why. It probably worked really well with Ghoul-a-Cabra. So maybe with the Ghoul nerf, this wasn't really necessary, but we'll see how this plays out. I don't have a strong opinion on this, to be fair. Scrap Scraper is prime example of something that is not relevant for Heimamar, because ain't nobody playing Ini, right? But again, Ini is a clean direction. You just play this, you farm, you get mechs, so I can see why it was performing too strong. Especially if you could cast Eyes of the Earth Mother on the tier 4. This does not apply to high level play. But it's just, I mean, the same as with all these heroes that go up a tier. It's just a bit slower now, a bit riskier. It comes online a turn later. Snack Fender going from a 5-4 to a 3-2. So this is actually kind of cool. With AFK, they didn't want to nerf her so much that she now doesn't buff the Snack Fender. They were just saying, okay, let's just make the Snack Fender a little smaller. So this has close to no impact, really. This is just going to make this slightly smaller, but it still buffs itself, so it's catching up in no time. I think AFK, again, for most levels of play, is actually fair, because it gives you a reasonable game plan. You put some 3-drops on your board, especially when Deflecto are in. You just put Deflecto on board, play some other tier 3 shields like Pharynx, and then you try to get a Drakari, and you just play Snack Vendor end of turn, and it's like, okay. But again, at Heimamar, that's not going to cut it. And the way you can look at this is, let's say you could get 50-50 per turn, but not more than that. The lower you go in terms of MMR, the longer that 50-50 is going to last you, because if an opponent giving complete, if you say just give a bunch of money to someone, or even just like a bunch of opportunity to someone, you give them a brand, you put them in a position where they can buy stuff, you need good judgment to really maximize that turn and maximize the output of that turn. So if you have a static number that you're getting, a static buff amount, that is at its absolute peak for beginners. And then as you go up the ladder, this becomes worse and worse and worse and worse and worse, because let's say your static buff arbitrary amount, 50-50 per turn, that's like twice as much as your competition would do at 4,000 MMR. But then once you get to 10,000 MMR, these guys might be getting 200 a turn. So then your 50-50 is completely irrelevant. So this is a good example of a hero that probably scales incredibly well the lower you go. So if you're a beginner, AFK is going to be fantastic, because you have a very clear game plan. You just get some Deflectobots, get some Pharynx, put the Snack Fender on the board, try to get a Drakari, and going to be good. As you climb, it's just going to be less and less relevant. Wow, Curator going from a tier 3 to a tier 4. I guess they're buffing Whelp Smuggler, which is kind of but it's like a small buff. It goes to a 2-5. Because this used to be a thing where you would play Peggy, Whelp Smuggler, Mishmash. Mishmash is still a tier 4, so you can play Eyes of the Earth Mother on it. Okay, this is probably then a justified nerf. If they're toning everything else down, this kind of play might actually become relevant. This might actually become playable to go for just straight up mid-game scaling and then just get huge mishmashes. You could put module on these things. George goes from a tier 4 to a tier 3. Maybe. That's my cough saving me from saying that maybe George is viable, but maybe in a Quillbore lobby, you can entertain it. But there's no more Gem Smuggler, so it'd have to be Piper, giving it extra damage and then just shield stuff, but it's so slow. Then this is one that I think is just plain wrong. It's so, I don't envy the devs' jobs, because they have to account for a wide variety of players. So it's very possible that the Watfin buff makes sense for like 90% of the player base or more. However, in my lobbies, this hero is insanely good already. So you're giving something that generates additional economy. that then gets a really good buddy that was already a tier 3, so it's super easy to get out on turn 4, and then you just hero power after you get it, because you can still do that in the same turn. You usually didn't have to hero power to get the money, and then you start stealing minions. Now, however, that does mean that you understand what minion your opponent is likely to have. The ability to do that, again, goes up a ton the better and the more experienced people are at the game. So while I can see why Watfin was probably underperforming and they buffed it, for high MMR, this is now amazing, right? Like a tier 2 buddy is so easy to gold. Like this thing is going to be golden in no time. Like you're going to probably be able to power level to 5 on 9 gold and then just slam the Watfin on 10 gold. And now you have a golden Watfin on turn 8, stealing 2 minions, and you're on tier 5, tripling into 6 drops. Or you do it the other way around, you make the golden buddy on 9 gold. But either way, you're either making a golden buddy on 9 gold or you're leveling to 5 and doing it afterwards, right? So it's not even so much the fact that it's a 2 cost or a 2 drop. That's not so much a problem for the early game, even though it's good because you might get this out on turn 3 now. Probably not, probably still turn 4, but just super cheap. But you're getting the golden variant super early. Like that's so dangerous. So that's really the problem with this. So for high MMR, I think this is going to be one of the best heroes in the game now. Okay, Edwin goes from a tier 2 to a tier 1. Yeah, Edwin is bad. This does not make me want to play Edwin. I think the problem is just that the scaling it's too bad compared to all the power creep that happened. We've had such power creep with just ability to go like Murky, scaling with Drakari. I can make 1,000 Murlocs. No matter what level the scout is at, I can't match that. So I can't afford to sit on like a lower tier to farm with the Edwin. But I mean, he's better, and it's, you know, if Edwin has a ton of armor, which I think he does, you also get to use this to level and get a 6 drop. So intuitively, this changes nothing. Then this is the second change that I really disagree with. But I can 100% see why they did it. This is not me saying like, I cannot believe what they were thinking. But for MMR, this makes no sense whatsoever. Because you have to understand what they did, right? They made all the buddies, or close to all the buddies, more expensive. So everyone else is like, let's say there's 9 frogs, there's this guy, there's this guy. Everyone else is waiting forever on their buddy. And you're giving Scabs the ability to steal it earlier. So the difference between Scabs and others heroes is just growing significantly. Why was this underperforming? Because usually whenever you see a buddy being changed from one tier to a lower tier, what that means is Blizzard has statistics on how a hero is performing, and Scabs was probably not performing well. And the reason for that is it takes skill to play a thief hero. Even though it looks lame and you're like, oh, he's just stealing the buddies, I guess he just wins now. For most players, if I throw a bunch of value at you, what happens is you lock up and you're like, oh my God, I could play 5 different comps. I can't choose, I'm dead, right? And we've all had that feeling. I've had that feeling. I've done that, right? That's part of the learning process. I still do that sometimes if I'm not fast enough. But for the most part, if you give a high-level player a shit ton of options and a shit ton of money, they're going to win the game. They're not going to lock up. They're just going to choose something and they're going to straight to the top. So that's what happens with almost all of my Scab games. I get this buddy out on turn 4 and it costs me an arm and a leg. I usually pay 9 gold for this to get it on turn 4. I just sell my board and get the buddy. Now I can get the buddy without selling my board. This is guaranteed on turn 4 now. Guaranteed Scabs buddy on turn 4. That is really good, right? That's going to give you so much more health to work with because you don't have to sell your board to do it. And you start stealing early from people that have to wait longer for their buddies. For the level of play that I play at, I really disagree with the Scabs and the Murloc Holmes buffs, but again, I can see where they're coming from. So I always want to be fair in these reviews. Because it's so easy to say, oh, they don't know what they're doing, right? And if it was so simple, then they wouldn't have done this. But I do assume that most people have a hard time navigating all the value that the buddy gives you, and they end up just dying. Because it's the opposite of something like an Eni. An Eni is, hey, this is your game plan. That's all you got to do. Get a lot of minions on the board that die. You're going to get a lot of mechs. You're going to get a buddy that increases stats whenever you play mechs. Just play mech. Whereas a Scabs buddy, it's like, here's a lot of different shit, figure it out. And that's hard. That's one of the most difficult things to do in this game. You get a lot of different stuff to do and you need to make the most out of it. But for high level players, that's exactly what they want. They want a lot of options. Okay, Varden goes from tier 4 to tier 3. I like that. Varden felt like slightly too slow to get this buddy out. I do love playing Varden in general, so for me, I really appreciate this change. This is gonna make me pick Varden a little bit more often. I was already picking him sometimes because I just love the Varden ability because it basically makes Golden Brand. You roll a brand, you can manipulate the shop to make it golden. And I do that almost every opportunity I get. So this is a great change for me. I really like this. Ice Snow goes from tier 4 to tier 3. Again, this is kind of like Edwin. It's just not relevant. This buddy is garbage, and it's probably going to require a rework. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong about it. It's definitely better than Edwin, by the way. Let's start with that. It's way better than Edwin because it scales automatically. Your hero power helps it out. It's gonna help Rokara, but you'd have to pick Rokara when other people are doing stuff like infinite battle cry manipulation, popping off. You're still picking a hero that is gonna have a hard time to level. The buddy it's gonna get some health, and it's, yeah, right? That's kind of my take. It's just It's like I'd have to play Rokara, and I don't want to play Rokara. Now, this, on the other hand, that's a very significant buff. Galewing is now a 1-drop. I'm okay with this. Excuse me. I'm okay with trying this out, seeing how it works. But right now I can already see a curve. I can already see it forming in my head where you do something like you take the first flight path on turn 1, which makes your minions strong, and you now win your fights. Right, so that's good. Then your second flight path is number 3, where you discover a minion from your tavern tier. Because this is now a 1-drop, what you can probably do is go for a fast 4 curve, but on turn 4, the 6 gold turn, you can level and get the flight trainer out, so that on turn 5, your hero power procs and you get 2 3-drops. And then you can level straight to 4 probably after that. Either take number 1 again and then reload number 3, or you can just take number 2 for some extra money. I haven't really figured that out, but there's some stuff here, right? You can cook some stuff now, where before with a tier 2 buddy, it would actually be too expensive and you wouldn't be able to follow that curve. So we'll see exactly how that plays out, but this could be dangerous. Because if you can get this on tier 5 or tier 6, when your second round of pulling minions from your tavern tier is about to happen, and you can golden this, what means is that you now get 3 6-drops or 3 5-drops that you discover, which is a huge power spike. So we'll see how that plays out. But it looks good. Waxadred goes from a tier 5 to a tier 4. That's honestly not like an insane change, because you don't really want to rush Waxadred. You want to wait until there's something worth stealing. And other people's buddies have now been made more expensive, so they're going to get them slower. So if you're wanting to steal buddies, it's harder to do that right now. However, I felt like it was okay at a 5-drop. I loved playing Togwell. I think it was pretty strong. So for me, this is just like, oh, neat. I just get this earlier. Now, I think Togwaggle lost a little bit of armor, so in the grand scheme of things, it probably balances out, and maybe the armor was even more beneficial, because we talked about how getting Waxadred so early doesn't really matter. Mutinous went from a tier 3 to a tier 2. So Mutinous used to be probably the best hero in the buddy meta. When the Ectoplasm Red, when you devour this, spit its stats onto 2 extra minions. So what you would do is you would just get a huge buddy by eating every turn, eating on top of the buddy, and then you make a huge minion, and then you transfer that to your buddy. Then you eat your buddy, and then you would make 2 more buddies, and then you would start eating on top of those buddies. And you would just get away with that because you would get so much tempo, because when you would eat your ectoplasm, so essentially you would make 1 big unit, then you would transfer that big unit to the ectoplasm, then you would transfer the ectoplasm to 2 extra minions, right? So it would go to 3 total, 1 from the hero power, 2 from the buddy, and you would just have 3 huge minions on the board, and you wouldn't lose for a long time, because you'd have like 3 30-30s, 40-40s in the early game, which is, or mid game, but it's still very good, especially if it's on Deflecto or something like that. And then that would give you time to start transferring those stats to 2 more buddies, and then you would just make huge boards, right? Because you would transfer the stats from a big one on top of a buddy, and then that buddy could jump to the other buddy, and just, oh, it's just so good. With that nerf, that doesn't necessarily break the game with Mutinous being a tier 2. However, I think for most MMRs, this is probably viable. You can still just do that strategy of building a big minion, then playing the buddy, transferring to the buddy, then you hero power the buddy onto 2 good targets, and then you transfer those to 2 more buddies, and you get some stats. And it's a lot easier to do because it's now a tier 2. So I'll probably try that at some point just to see. But again, for most MMRs, I think it's fine. At very high level, this is probably still too slow. Zerella becomes a tier 2. Cool. Neat, right? Fine. We'll take that. Zerella was definitely not OP. She has a good hero power, but the buddy was not great. So it's just one of those things where, sure, I'll take it. And then I'll just hope to build a good comp and use the elephant for tempo. Gallywix goes from tier 4 to tier 3. That's fair. Gallywix was actually struggling a little bit, which is funny, because he was just getting so outdone by all the value buddies. Now with the removal of death scale, It's going to be harder for people to do that, especially also with the buddies increasing tavern tier. But I don't think Gallywix is suddenly OP now, because it's still a choose one. It's not a battle cry effect. You have to choose either attack or health. Back when Gallywix was really OP in buddy meta, it would be a battle cry and it would buff both health and damage, and that was so dumb. It was like the best thing ever, because you would combo it with Bran, you would spend like 50 gold, and then you just watch your minion go boonk, boonk. You would just buy a little cleave and it would be 100 cleave in one turn. Like, for real. Ridiculous. But yeah, those are different times. Voon goes from tier 4 to tier 3. Same thing here. Voon was probably just losing a little bit too often to just make it a little bit stronger. I think it's probably going to be a pretty decent pick just due to all the other buddies getting nerfed and then Voon getting buffed. So I like this. I think this is now going to be like quite a good hero. Now we have, Flurk going from tier 5 to tier 3. So that is basically, oh my god, Flurk basically doesn't win. Right? We rarely see a 2-tier drop, right? We can see a 2-tier jump when something is like, holy crap, this thing is destroying everyone. We got to jump it up 2 tiers, like the Snake Eyes buddy. But we rarely see something like, oh, let's make it 2 tiers cheaper. So Battlecry transform minions in the tavern to Murlocs of the same tier. Primal Fin is no longer on tier 4, and that's probably what caused this. Because back when Primal Fin was on tier 4, you would be on tier 4, you would roll a lot of 4s, you would play your buddy, and you would farm Golden Primal Fin. Probably what caused it to really underperform now is that Primal Fin was removed from tier 4. It's now on tier 5. So I wonder, with the new buddy here being on tier 3, if it's actually possible to farm Golden Primal Fin with this now on tier 5. That's going to be a good experiment. We might try a Flurk. I'd have to see how much armor he has. Thorim was changed to a tier 2 buddy. That also makes sense. I pretty much, whenever I played Thorim, I felt like I had time to make 1 7-drop, and then I had to sell this thing. So it being a tier 2 makes it a bit easier to golden. Maybe you can squeeze more 7-drops out of this thing now. At lower MMR, this is probably going to be a change that people don't understand, and it'll be like, oh my god, this is so good because I was already getting 7-drops. But that's because you're not being pressured as much, and you wouldn't have to sell this thing. For higher level boards, like having this 10-4 on your board, or what is a 12-6 before the nerf, was actually really, that was tough to keep, to justify, because it's really weak and you're making a random 7-drop, and that 7-drop might not be good for combat. So that's 2 board slots that are not doing anything into combat, and maybe you would have a Bran as well. So essentially almost the majority of your board wouldn't be combat minions, and that means you're just taking damage over and over and over again. So we'll see how this change affects it. When would you get this out? You would get this out on turn 3? Yeah, turn 3 or turn 4. Turn 4 would be really easy to get, so maybe turn 4. You get it out on turn 4, and you'd have enough money to buy. You'd have enough money to buy a 2-drop. So turn 4, you would be upgrading a 2-drop into a 3, and then you could take that to a 7. You could maybe even make a golden minion when your upgraded minion is on 5, and then you could probably get a 7 and then get another 5 the next turn, get another 7. That could be a curve that works. Yeah, now that it's a tier cheaper, the golden one is also cheaper. So get this on turn 4, upgrade a 2-drop into a 3-drop, then on turn 6, might be too tough to golden this on 6 though when it's a 5. We'll see. Either way, we should be able to get the golden at least for a second 7-drop, if not more. Daryl goes from a tier 4 to a tier 2. So again, right, this is a holy crap, Daryl cannot win any games. Let's make this a tier 2. And do we care? No, we don't, because we'd have to play Daryl, and Daryl sucks right now. We'll see. Maybe there is some cute little strategy I'm missing right now. Madame Goya going from a tier 4 to a tier 5. That makes a lot of sense. It's no longer targetable by Eyes of the Earth Mother. It's harder to get. I'm gonna be honest, I'm not playing duos right now, mainly because I just don't have time to get the level of understanding for solos to make this kind of content and also do duos. But I'll be having a podcast with my friend Educated Collins later today, and he is all about duos right now, so that's gonna be really cool. We're gonna have a super balanced input for the podcast. So if you're really interested in duos and how these changes affect the game, you'll be able to tune into the podcast and get his take on it. Okay guys, that was the patch review. I hope you enjoyed it.